Hello, SRFC. So, typically, I was the one who closed off our last meeting by saying we'd be back, coronavirus permitting. And lo and behold, a whole bunch of social distancing and lockdown measures have come in that's meant that we haven't been able to meet. But the fantastic Phil Exon has been doing an amazing job in bringing us a set of daily videos from writers to just kind of help bring a little bit of SRFC goodness into our lives during the lockdown and until we can meet again. So, as part of that series, I am absolutely delighted to be bringing you a short interview with Farah Mendlesohn. So she is the academic who has literally written the book on science fiction and fantasy, both as author and as editor. She is a Hugo winner for her Cambridge Companion to Science Fiction. She has also edited the Cambridge Companion to Fantasy. Her Rhetorics of Fantasy codified as a taxonomy for fantasy novels. She's chaired the Science Fiction Foundation. She's been president of the International Association of the Fantastic and the Arts. She co-chaired Iterbium, which was last year's EasterCon and still the best convention I've ever been to. She's co-chair of FantasyCon 2022, and fingers crossed that will be happening later this year. And she's the author of the Hugo-nominated Pleasant Profession of Robert A. Heinlein, which we are going to talk about today. But in starting, I wanted to just warn the ailurophobes among you that there may be literal and figurative cats in this interview, so you might want to tune out now if you are not a cat person. So, Farah, why Robert A. Heinlein?
Well, it goes back a very long way. I wrote my undergraduate dissertation on science fiction history. I was looking at the way in which the way women were portrayed changed over a 20-year period. And I picked 6 authors, 3 men and 3 women, and I have to do this on my fingers. So the 3 women were Le Guin, Tiptree, and Marion Zimmer Bradley. We didn't know about Marion Zimmer Bradley's nasty past at that point. Harry Harrison, Samuel Delany, and Robert Heinlein. And it wasn't that Heinlein was the most left-wing, that would be silly. It was all the other authors, where they started was more or less where they finished in that period. Whereas that wasn't true for Heinlein at all. Between 65 and 85, you could track massive changes. And I found that argument that the change is just fascinating.
Because you talk in the foreword about his writing being this 50-year-long argument with himself, which is just a wonderful description of a writer kind of finding their way through what they think and using fiction to explore a lot of those issues.
Yeah, so the thing that makes my book different to everybody else's is that I literally cover everything. And I didn't try to do it in chronological order. So there's another book by Tom Clareson that came out a couple of years before this one. Actually, he'd written it many years earlier and a friend finished it off and updated it, in which he goes through a novel at a time. And that's fine. But I just do that for a chapter. And what I try to do is to actually look at the different themes that Heinlein was interested in, as well as the ones I was interested in, and look at how he kept coming back to them over and over again. Liberty is a very good one that he constantly revisits. The nature of the economy, ethics. He's very, very interested in how people make ethical choices. Notions of citizenship, how to raise your children was very high up the list. So that watching how that developed, sometimes in a left-wing way, sometimes in a right-wing way, sometimes utterly bizarre, just gave you a much more kind of spiral effect in which you could see his thinking crossing over itself. Actually, one of the most obvious ones is his changing attitudes to different modes of sexuality from, say, 1960 in Stranger in a Strange Land, where there's real disapproval of homosexuality, to the end of his career, where his family have homosexuals, transsexuals, polyfamilies, and there's a much greater diversity, so that you can see him revisiting those thoughts and rethinking them. And yeah, it's entrancing.
And you've always brought kind of quite a multidisciplinary approach to your academic work, because you describe yourself as a historian, but a lot of your focus is on fiction and on literature. So there's something really fascinating about how you bring that kind of historians' discipline into a literary world?
I think the biggie is that I don't regard one text as a source. It's not evidence. I actually see this a lot. If you look at a standard literature PhD, it will often have 5 chapters, one on each on a different book. And my comment is always, how can you prove something from that? Any of my students will come out having read about 150 books and written about 50 in the thesis. And that's very much, for me, how it works. There's a cat walking behind the computer. It's distracting. The idea that you assemble things, that you triangulate material, that you think about what somebody might have read, what would they have access to. But the other side to that is I got quite interested in linguistics when I was a teenager because my mother was studying it. And I didn't do linguistics. But I then ended up managing a department of linguists. And they taught me about rhetoric. They taught me about, hang on 2 seconds. They taught me about stylistics and poetics. Now, he probably won't stay, even though he's very much a lap cat. But this is Miles. And there is a Miles in the book. Come on, Miles, cooperate. Okay, blue eyes. You'll find him at the back of the book in a picture. There you go. Heinlein would approve. But the interest in the way language works and the way language developed, I think that was the key one, because that shaped my revisiting of some of the earlier texts, which are often written off. So if you know, for example, that Heinlein's second wife was a script editor, then some of the, less right-on, slightly coercive sex banter suddenly makes sense of having come right out of the 1950s movies. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And
He's kind of a bit of a sponge. He's absorbing a lot of what's going on around him and the context in which he's working and the people that he's associating with.
And it also makes me much more attentive to what he didn't say, because there's an awful lot of misquotes of Heinlein around. So there's a misquote from Friday where we're told that Friday says if you're being raped, just lie back and enjoy it. That's not what she says. She says you should lie back and pretend you're enjoying it in order to stay alive. But that quote is there in the short story Let There Be Light from the 1940s. So we can see that shift in language. And Let There Be Light is absolutely designed to be played by Cary Grant and Katharine Hepburn. It's absolutely a bringing up baby type script.
Yeah, and it's because he's such a fascinating figure, and he kind of sits there as kind of one of these big towering people that has shaped the genre.
Hang on, I'm about to lose sound if the cat gets, thank you. The cat was about to take the sound out. Sorry folks.
So he's one of those kind of like big three or four names that one of the big 3 writers, him, Clarke, and Asimov, working in an environment very much shaped by Campbell. And you know, as a young reader coming in, and I've got really, I kind of come out in hives at the idea that there is a canon that everyone must read, and everyone must read.
Yeah.
Clarke,
I'm not in that camp.
No, I always found Clarke very dry and writing very bad characters. Asimov, I kind of bounced off foundation fairly hard because it felt very dry. But Heinlein had such vibrance, you know, and as a teenager coming across, and I can't remember whether it was The Moon is a Harsh Mistress or Stranger in a Strange Land, in my school library as a 14-year-old girl, and you just get so much life and freshness, and it felt very vivid and very.
We remember his characters. We remember the people. I want to correct you on something though. Heinlein isn't, strictly speaking, a Campbellian author. He's older than the others to start with. He's a grown man. I think he might even be slightly older than Campbell, although I wouldn't bank on that. I wouldn't swear to that. But if anything, it's Heinlein that influences Campbell as much as the other way round. So we know that Sixth Column was a Campbell idea, and it's a thoroughly Campbell idea. It's racist as hell. Heinlein ends up coming back, rewriting it, sticking in a heroic Japanese character, trying to mute it. It doesn't really work, but he does try. It's a problem. But Heinlein breaks with Campbell in part because he doesn't share those values. He doesn't think aliens should always be inferior. He won't write all white futures. Often the non-whiteness of characters in the children's books is signalled pretty subtly in ways that I didn't necessarily pick up when I was younger. So Podkayne is not white. The captain in Space Cadet is not white.
And Johnny Rico is a Filipino person.
Exactly. And all of this is hinted all the way through. The other one is Tunnel in the Sky. The evidence is there suggests very strongly that Rod is black, is African-American. Otherwise, why else could he remind an African girl of her little brother? So things like that. So he's very much not a Campbellian writer. He's just, in some ways, he's the writer Campbell takes credit for.
And Heinlein is always kind of felt like a bit of a massive contradiction. So for all you've described, a kind of bunch of very strong and ethnically diverse main characters, this is also the writer that wrote Farnham's Freehold. He writes these amazing women who are so full of agency and competent and clever, and kind of they manage to be clever and beautiful, which women don't often get to be in contemporary fiction.
And redhead. He really liked redheads.
But there's a kind of a strong thread of gender essentialism through a lot of what he writes. As you said, he can be very liberal on sex, but quite heteronormative for a large part of his career. There's a whole bunch of contradiction in his work.
Okay. So let's deal with Farnham's Freehold first, which isn't really a contradiction. So first of all, Heinlein doesn't really understand racial prejudice. He calls it colour prejudice, and that's what he means. So as we go later into books, he doesn't understand institutionalised racism at all. He's in that category of everybody is equal now, what's the problem? And that's why he starts to miss the boat. But he was also convinced he wasn't a science fiction writer, he was a satirist. And that really influenced his later career. He desperately wanted to be Jonathan Swift. The writers he admired were Swift, Jurgen, Kipling, all of those deeply political writers. If you only read the first 2/3 of Farnham's Freehold and finished with Joseph's explanation of what it's like to be a black man in Alabama, we would regard it as a work of art. Okay? But unfortunately, and the reason I'm so sure of this is because he uses the metaphor at least 5 times in other books, Heinlein likes the dual metaphor. One, of all values being relative, and in some places it's okay to eat your father. And 2, Jonathan Swift's The Modest Proposal. And I am convinced that what he thought he was writing was not an if this goes on, but look how badly we treat black people, this is effective cannibalism, they would do it to us if we gave them the chance, therefore we should reform. Unfortunately, he isn't any good at it. And the last third is an absolute car crash.
Yeah.
But the reason I'm so sure about this is because, and this is back to cats, watch the cat. And Joseph is the hero because it's Joseph who looks after the cat. So if you follow the cat, you can always see who the good person is. And the hero in this book is Joseph. And that's the other fact you see. If you read all of Heinlein, you start to realize that almost with the exception of Lazarus Long, all his protagonists are sidekicks. Whether we're talking Matt in Space Cadet, the Rod in Tunnel in the Sky, wherever you look, even in Stranger in a Strange Land, where we're told it mostly through Janet's point of view, the protagonists are sidekicks. So is it Hugh in Farnham's Freehold? I think it's Hugh, is not the protagonist. Joseph is.
And it's a really interesting writing technique that I see a lot of other writers do, and it's something, actually now you're thinking about it, I see Guy Gavriel Kay use a lot, particularly for key themes, is to view that from the sidekick as a way of bringing the reader in as an observer into the scene, and it's quite a powerful way of integrating them in.
But Heinlein manages to do it while convincing us that the protagonist is the main character. But over and over again, they're not. So I think it's a dreadful book, but I don't think he intended it to be a dreadful book. it's a tricky one.
Yeah, so it sounds like what you're saying is
He
that
wasn't trying to write a white supremacist novel. The fact that he did is because he was shit at satire. And you can see that in later books as
ambitious,
well.
but not
Yeah.
successful.
And just to take the last bit about gender essentialism, I don't disagree, but I would challenge one bit that people tend to plump for. It isn't that Heinlein thinks women should have babies, it's he thinks everybody should. The tragedy of his life was that he was childless. I'm always a bit careful about psychoanalysis, but there's really no secret about this. He desperately wanted kids. What they seem to have lied to each other, each saying to the other that it was their fault. So Virginia tried to convince him it wasn't his fault, but he'd had TB and he'd had something in the 20s that was probably VD. And I think he was almost certainly sterile. And he was desperate to adopt, but she was clearly not all that interested in it. He was a very good father. He loved godfather. He loved other people's kids. He was very generous towards them. So what we actually have is a growing kid-centeredness in the later books, where having children becomes vital. The person he matches up with actually is Bujold. I don't know if she has children or not, but her books, I think it's Cordelia Naismith who says all true wealth is biological. And when I was younger, I thought that was cool, and now I find it creepy. But I think that's a Heinlein idea.
Yeah, and he's a writer that it feels that contemporary works are still kind of going back and engaging with the things that he was doing thematically, stylistically, and some of the motifs. And even, you know, and I love the idea that one of the defining things about genre is that it's perpetually in dialogue with itself. It's a conversation and
Yes.
kind of a reinterpretation and a re-exploration of things all the time. And Charlie Stross has been quite explicit that Saturn's Children is a bit of response to novels like Friday. If you look at John Scalzi's Old Man's War, which is so Starship Troopers in a
Absolutely
way, and the one that, and I know you are not a Doctor Who person, but when I saw the January episode Resolution, which is a Dalek episode, and I was shocked that actually I saw it, and it was one of those things that felt so obvious that I was surprised no one had done it before, to take the Dalek as the puppet master and to play in that space and to bring in all of those influences. So it still feels like he's the kind of person that we still keep coming back to and keep wanting to re-engage with.
Well, there's a Heinlein novel on the Hugo list this year. Cameron Hurley's The Light Brigade is absolutely Starship Troopers, chapter by chapter, done properly. I recommend it very highly. It's a lovely book, absolutely smashing. But I did not expect to pick up a book and find myself reading what is essentially Starship Troopers, but with all the modern complexity, the different thought about why people fight, etc. Actually, that's a very good book to think about the position of the protagonist, because everybody assumes that we're supposed to follow Johnny Rico, but we are told by Johnny Rico's best friend that Johnny is a follower. Johnny is not a leader.
If you can put your finger on it, so why do we keep then coming back to Heinlein and his themes and his motifs? What is it about him writing then that if I can force you to kind of crystallize it?
Because I don't know if we're going to carry on doing, and that's fine. We may be reaching kind of the end of that. I think it's because what he grasped is that for most of us, history happens around us, and we are bit players. We aren't necessarily the movers and shakers. I'm not going to name names, but I'm reading a lot of books for the Clark Award this year, and I am so sick of aristocracies. I do not give two hoots what kings, queens, heads of empire and industry are doing. I really don't.
Well, so much contemporary fantasy is just Downton Abbey with magic.
I'm talking science fiction.
Really?
Okay, there's it's disguised as heads of industry, but it's still basically court fiction. And Heinlein doesn't do that. If you think of The Moon is a Harsh Mistress, Manny ends up at the center of events because he's in the wrong hall at the wrong time, but he's not actually one of the movers and shakers. He's sent down to Earth in part as a sacrificial victim. The people who send him know he's going to be treated badly. It's going to make great news. Yeah, it's going to be wonderful sound bites. Heinlein, I think, gets that. So I think it's partially that, and just that, yes, his characters are really interesting. Oh, and how we read them changes with time. So I first read Maureen in Sail Beyond the Sunset in 1987, and I hated the book. I thought it was an absolute sellout of feminism. And now I'm the same age as Maureen. I get the book. It's not a sellout of feminism. It's that awful weariness that you're still fighting the same damn fight. And you still have to use tools that you really wish you didn't have to use. And you still find yourself looking at a bloke and saying, no, you can't use my work for free. You wouldn't listen to me when I started it. You didn't want to take part in the project. It's the bit where the families try to take over her investments, and she makes the point that they refuse to take the tips from her. She got them from Lazarus when he came back in time. So it's things like that. I also love the bit where she just decides she's so done with parenting and kicks her two youngest children out.
It's been quite tempting. I think particularly for a lot of parents at the moment, kind of trying to do homeschooling and lockdown, I can imagine it's...
So a book that I originally didn't like at all now makes much more sense. And I really like that. But I also think that, to come back to why do people like Heinlein, that one's fascinating. I think it's Heinlein writing himself as a woman. It's his life story, transition to what would it have been like if I was female. It's fascinating.
And I wanted to make sure that we had time to talk about my favourite chapter in the book, which is the epilogue, which I know is a chapter that very nearly didn't make it in.
Yes, there were arguments about whether that should go in or not. My beloved said it should not because it was trivial. Yes,
trivial. So
it is actually one of the bits people come up and say they love best. But it had to be an epilogue because it didn't fit anywhere else. I couldn't put it anywhere else. But here was all this stuff about cats that just traipse their ways through the books, becoming more and more real as time goes by.
And this is an entire chapter about cats in Heinlein's fiction, and particularly the principal cats in Heinlein's fiction. And I love that it was there because for me, when I read Puppet Masters, one of the most shocking things was what happened to pirates. You know, that was the bit as a cat owner where the horror and the panic and just the awfulness of what was going on really came home was the fate of pirates. And as anyone who's had to face those kind of awful decisions when your cat is terminally ill, and when do you face the decision about putting them to sleep, having a puppet master control pirate around the place, it was genuinely
awful,
horrifying.
But it's also, I think, it's why I think Friday is such a good book. So the book I compare Friday to is Ursula Moray Williams' Gobelino, the Witch's Cat. I don't know if you've read it.
Not in years, not so long, I can't remember.
Very old-fashioned book. Nobody would write a book this way because Gobelino wants to be ordinary, and Gobelino wins at the end by no longer being a witch's cat. And the commonest criticism of Friday is that Friday becomes ordinary. But if you see Friday as Gobelino the witch's cat who wants to be ordinary, the trajectory works. And in addition, you can tell which family is a good family by how they treat their cats. When the original family breaks up, they put the cats down. They send them away for medical research. I was like, how could you do that? And Friday tries to put it out of her mind, but she could feel the cat round her feet. It's just dreadful. Whereas we know the second family is good because Janet won't leave because she'd have to leave the cats behind. You know, they're terrified, there's murderers at the door, but she can't abandon the cats. And when Friday meets up with them again on the colonization ship, there's Mama Cat in the basket, and one of my favorite lines, and the kittens were found responsible jobs as pest control officers on a sheep station. And that's what I mean about you follow the cat, you know who the heroes are, you know who the good people are. And in Friday, I think he just creates that metaphor perfectly, that Friday becomes the little lost kitten who's been abused and beaten and told she doesn't matter. And eventually she finds a home where she does. And by that point, I'm usually tearing up. So
And the descriptive writing of the cats, and the way, the personalities that they have, and the relationships with their owners, it feels so authentic to anyone that lives around or with or shares space with cats. Because I still don't think you own them. It's more that you just choose to live together, as it's a sort of mutually beneficial arrangement, and
it extends.
Big personalities.
It extends to the other thing that I keep pointing out about Heinlein. Far from being a cold, hard SF writer, he's actually an enormously sentimental, character-driven, sociological SF writer. And yet somehow he always gets lumped in with the hard SF people, and he's not at all. And so if anything, I think he's the father of sociological science fiction.
And I wonder if some of that's more where some of his longevity comes from, and his easy readability is because, and as I think you say in the book, he's interested in the books that are set in the future, not about the future.
Yes, I think that's true. And he got some things dead right. There's a bit in Friday where she talks about how these days, it's either Friday or I Will Fear No Evil. Friday's the one where she goes to a bathroom in California and is almost prosecuted for acquiring a gender-based bathroom, which I thought was hilarious. And the idea is everywhere, all that matters is whether you wish to point or sit. You know, which one do you want? But the actual gender doesn't matter, it's what you want to do. And it's either in that one or I Will Fear No Evil, where we learn that young people have decided there are at least 7 genders. And it's like, Heinlein, you nailed it. So there's something. Yeah.
Mobile phones as well.
Absolutely. But it's fascinating. Yeah, as we discussed before, I can talk for hours about Heinlein.
and I'm kind of really conscious that we've really just scratched the surface a little bit here of
there's a book.
A man and a book and a book.
And can I just say the shocking thing is it's 30,000 words shorter than the first draft.
Blimey, because it's quite a thick one.
Well, so just to finish off, the original story is that this was commissioned by Illinois University Press, and I've always been terribly grateful to them because I knew I wanted to write a book on Heinlein, but they commissioned it for 70,000 words, and the first draft came out at 180.
And I know you write long, but that's still a lot.
Yeah, so we parted amicably, and I will always be grateful to them because it wouldn't have been written otherwise. But there was no way it was going through University Press at that length.
No, so it's been published by Unbound, I think, and you crowdsourced.
Yes,
the fund.
Quite a few of the people watching this will have helped pay for it, and I'm terribly grateful to all of you. We crowdsourced it in 10 days flat, and particularly satisfying for a Jewish person, we crowdfunded it between Yom Kippur and Rosh Hashanah.
Wonderful.
10 days.
Wonderful. So what we might do is draw to an end there now, and it's been kind of a very quick kind of survey over the kind of the highlights of what's a very deep and very interesting man. But I have in closing one question from SRFC regular and organizer Magnus Anderson, who wanted to just observe about Heinlein's impressive commitment to the plaid jacket, and wanted to know if his fashion sense comes up in your book at all.
Yes, it does. The wonderful bits with Richard in the book I otherwise don't much like, The Cat Who Walked Through Walls. There's all the descriptions. Richard goes shopping and comes back with a bright pink suit with ruffles and earrings and makeup, and it's just lovely. And there's lovely descriptions of women's gowns. But okay, so here's a small point I want to make. I've had people make assumptions about how Heinlein describes people. Heinlein mostly doesn't describe people, but he does tell us what they're wearing. And he has great fun with it. He really does. He loves describing people having baths, people showering, people kissing. There's a whole segment in the book on kissing, but definitely the fashion, what people are wearing. And it kind of makes sense because he's very much from a period where boys were expected to look spiffy too.
Yeah, and why not?
If I had to say one last thing, is that when you read the Heinlein novel, you walk away with the sense that the author enjoyed writing it.
They are such tremendous fun to read, which is always pretty much exactly what I need at the moment as well. I'm all about the fun books at the moment. Anything that's
Oh, absolutely.
worthy and difficult is,
Yes.
despite what Adam Roberts may think, this is not a time for me to be challenging my ontology. This is a time where I want fun and escapism. So I wanted to say thank you so much for giving.
Thank you.
Time. And hopefully we will get to see you in person at an SRFC at some point. I think we'd love to have you come down and talk a little bit more. We wish you all the best with the Hugo nomination for the book. It's a really stiff category, best related work this year, and it's interesting that this book is up against Jeanette Ng's Campbell acceptance speech. And
Gwyneth Jones' book on Joanna Ross, and a book by Le Guin. So I think we assume I'm not taking home this trophy, and that's fine.
It's a really tough field, but we wish you all the best with it. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And thank you, those of you who are watching, for tuning in and continuing to tune in. We're really grateful for your support. I want to reinforce, we will be back. SRFC will be back. In the meantime, keep tuning in. Phil's doing an amazing job sourcing all these videos. Tell your friends about them too, and stay safe and wash your hands.